I am still dealing with some of the kind of hardwired tensions and contradictions that we end up with, despite sort of better intentions. Otherwise, shifting a little bit toward urban greening here, or shifting a lot toward urban greening here, I should say. By way of introduction of myself, my research in general is focused on this question right here. So how do we make cities greener and socially just at the same time? It's not a particularly new question. It's something that has been on the minds, especially people doing urban greening for at least a century. But I'm particularly today going to talk about some of my ongoing work looking at two contemporary issues. One tackling the issue of green gentrification, and the other tackling the issue of what I call urban climate risk shift, which is a closely related topic. So I'm going to talk about two either completed or recently completed research topics and research articles, and then a little bit of where I'm taking them, what I'm doing next, a little bit of ongoing work as well. So to begin with, green gentrification. This is an early definition of what is currently termed green gentrification. It comes from Sarah Dooling in 2009. It's not the first, but it's one of the early ways of expressing what is meant here. And Sarah said it is the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. And very importantly here, she was starting the framing off, looking at the most economically vulnerable population, and she was particularly looking at the unhoused population and was examining how new green space development was used as a way of essentially removing unhoused populations from parts of the city. And of importance here is she was looking at the population of people whose literal right to occupy the urban space is the most openly contested. Of anyone, unhoused people are the most vulnerable to people simply saying they do not have the right to occupy the space. And so she was starting there on that extreme, looking at the people whose right to occupy urban space is the most openly contested, and sort of setting this agenda a little bit from that point. I'll come back to that, the importance of that in a little bit. Since the early 2000s, the green gentrification agenda within academia has evolved a bit. And I would say it's evolved toward a much deeper conversation with practitioners as well. But at least until a couple of years ago, the general hypothesis of the green gentrification literature could be stated as this. Urban greening in a neighborhood during a given time period contributes to or accelerates gentrification in that neighborhood during the period immediately following. So basically, the green gentrification literature has moved beyond sort of looking at the most vulnerable to say, looking at areas with different degrees of vulnerability in terms of the population that lives there, economic vulnerability, cultural vulnerability, social vulnerability, physical vulnerability, and asking how greening kind of interacts with this process of potentially gentrifying and then potentially displacing some of that population. The study that I co-led, which was published in July of 2022 in Nature Communications, takes on that hypothesis. And it sort of asks, how generalized a problem is this? Is green gentrification actually something that's out there? And if so, is it sort of like a widespread phenomenon, or is it something more narrow than that? And so what we did is take this kind of big picture view, and we looked at 28 cities in Europe and North America. They're listed, they're mapped out here. And we looked at the period between 1990 and 2016. And I'll talk to you a bit about how we did this, but basically we tested that hypothesis of, does greening in the implementation of new green space in one period, is it relevant in explaining processes of gentrification in the time period that follows that? And that's the beginning hypothesis that we're working with. We selected these 28 cities because they give us a variety of kind of growth trajectories. Some of them are rapidly growing cities, some of them are declining cities, some of them are kind of cities that have experienced peaks and valleys in the time period that we're looking at. So we didn't want it to be as easily explained by just growth trajectories. We wanted it to be something that could be looking at a variety of different cities. In order to do this, we first developed a custom gentrification measure. And there's a particular reason why we had to do this. That's because the cities that we're looking at are in, I think, 12 different countries. And so the data and the notion of gentrification and how we actually operationalize it looks very different in these different countries. And so we had to start by thinking about that. So I won't go into the details of this. All I'll say is that what we did is we basically developed a gentrification score, which is this G-tract variable, which is gentrification at the tract level, the census tract level. And then we built these custom variables, which are called vulnerability, university education, professional status, income, below poverty level, and then changes in rent. And we're able to find variables for that across all of these cities for all the time periods that we're looking for. By kind of vulnerability encompasses race and ethnicity variables, but it's different for each city. You can imagine race and ethnicity vulnerability in Vienna is very different than race ethnicity vulnerability in San Francisco, right? So we had to kind of account for that difference a little bit here. But the important thing, so we did that. That's standardizing across all these countries. And then the other important thing we did is we looked for not only the amount of change that happened relative in the direction that we might expect for gentrification, but also the diversity of change. So how many of these variables were changing at the same time? Basically saying if you have income and race, ethnicity, and education and professional status all changing at the same time in the direction of gentrification, that's stronger than if you just have an income change happening, but all the other things aren't really changing all that much. So we had a kind of degree and diversity measure standardized across all these countries for gentrification, and that's step one for us. That's essentially our dependent variable. It's what we're testing. What explains that outcome right there. We then plugged that into, and I won't go into the details here, but we plugged it into a large Bayesian spatial autoregressive model, which is simply to say we put a bunch of variables in and ask which ones matter when you account for all the other variables that are there. The variables we tested to see which ones help us explain gentrification included new green space, which is our key test variable, as well as new residential development, new transit infrastructure, proximity to city center. All of these things might explain gentrification according to our understanding of it. Might be at least help us to explain, I should say, not fully explain. And then we added several control variables that might limit the amount of green space that you could put in a place, like the density, the existing density and prior greening levels and things like that. So it's a big model, but basically the idea is where does green space stack up relative to these other things when you account for all these other things that are happening in urban space in order to help us explain gentrification. What did we find? We found this. We found that at the city level, and this is, I want to really emphasize this a little bit and explain it a little bit. At the city level, so we're basically taking them all, when you consider all of the new green spaces that the city put in across the entire city, is the trend of the effect for all of these new green spaces toward increased gentrification in the period that follows or not? And that's sort of what we're asking. Not does it one individual green space cause this, but when you account for the entire green space agenda of the city, where's the trend going? So whenever you see the green arrow followed by a green bar, that's a positive effect. Basically, that's where we're seeing a relevant role for green space in explaining gentrification from one time period to the next. So basically, the cities you see listed here are cities that we would call green gentrification cities. There's 17 out of 28 cities that came up with this result. You might note that Vancouver is on this list. It's right here. The reason that these things are differentiated is because it's not that we have a few decades that we're looking at here, and so it's not that there's like always a fully sustained greening to gentrification relationship. Sometimes it's only one shorter time period within that 26 year period. Sometimes it's it's in the early parts and the later parts, but not in the middle parts. So it happens in different ways. But all of these cities showed, at least for one portion of our time period study, an overall trend toward green gentrification, which is to say that sometimes it was sustained throughout, sometimes it was sustained only for part of the time. Vancouver falls into the sustained throughout period, which is to say that when you think about it as a big picture question at the city scale, greening happens often, but not all. Green gentrification happens often, but not all of the time. And for 11 of the cities that we studied, we found no evidence of a kind of overall green gentrification effect that we could point toward. We talk about some of the differences in the paper about why we maybe see it in some cities and not others, maybe why some cities fall into this category as opposed to others. There's a couple of surprises. There's a lot here that probably won't surprise people in terms of that outcome. But how do we understand this overall? What was our takeaway from this sort of large study, which the data took us several years to get together. So that was a big part of this of the study as well. But the takeaway was this: greening is often, but not always, associated with gentrification at the citywide scale. We think about overall, the net effect of all the green space that we've been adding is what's its relationship to gentrification. Often, but not always, associated with gentrification. And importantly, this association manifests in different ways in different cities. So we classified kind of 3 different types of green gentrification that we saw. One is what we call lead green gentrification. And this is where basically we argued that green space is actually the most important predictor of gentrification on this overall measure. And so if we think about green space relative to the role that new transit infrastructure or new residential development or proximity to city center are playing, it's green space. That's really the relevant driver. This is the thing that's explaining things the most. That's what we would call lead green gentrification. Then we have a group of cities that we put into the integrated green gentrification. And this is where green space is a relevant predictor of gentrification in the period that follows its implementation. But transit also matters a lot, or new residential development also matters a lot, or proximity to cities. So it's kind of just mixed into a kind of milieu of things that are shaping what's happening when it comes to gentrification. And then there's cities that we would call subsidiary green gentrification, where green space is relevant, but other things matter more. Really, transit or new real estate development are really driving what's happening there. But green space is part of the picture, but it's not really the most important part. All of these are green gentrification studies, but different manifestations, different ways that it comes about. Vancouver does fall into lead on this category, in case you're curious. So that's kind of like a big picture start to address that ongoing hypothesis from the green gentrification literature. From there, I have worked with a few colleagues now to try to basically now say, okay, let's localize that. Let's go from this big citywide scale and think about what's happening on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, or on a green space by green space basis. What kind of relationships do we see? And this is also more where the green gentrification literature is going, and shifting away from that hypothesis of, okay, that sort of simplified hypothesis of, okay, we have a new green space, is that then followed by gentrification, for what is maybe now being referred to more as a green gentrification cycle, something that's a little bit more integrated over time, which is to say, it might be that gentrification raises demand for greening. It might be that greening raises demand for gentrification. It might be, so you might see greening after gentrification. And the answer is all of that happens, right? So you have all those dynamics happening. You have greening bringing gentrification, gentrification bringing more demand for greening, and et cetera. And this is kind of circular relationship. So basically, the next step for us is to localize at the neighborhood scale. What's the temporal relationship? How often do we see it before, after, during gentrification? What does that mean in different neighborhoods? What are some of the dynamics we can point toward in terms of how we might start to intervene in these cycles at the local neighborhood scale? And just to emphasize, we have been in conversations with a few sort of cities about what to do from a policy side, and we do have a number of policy interventions in mind, but this localizing is very important for that process. So how do we think about this at a neighborhood by neighborhood scale? So I have an ongoing project there. I just published an article with a PhD student here named Jessica Quinton and Lori Nesbitt in urban forestry, as well as Elvin Wiley in geography. And we just published submitted an article in this realm, and ongoing work is going in this direction. So one next step for me is this: localizing the trends. How do we think about green gentrification neighborhood by neighborhood, and especially the temporal relationship at the smaller scale? And then the other big picture sort of shift for me in terms of where this goes, that I wanted to spend the rest of my time trying to frame out a little bit for you, is connecting processes of green gentrification with planning for urban climate justice in cities, and sort of what we can learn from there and carry over to the notion of climate planning and climate intervention, mitigation, and adaptation in cities. This is, for me, quite relevant because going back to Sarah Dooling's early framing of the notion, to the extent that greening becomes a tool for helping to define who does and does not have the right to occupy urban space, or who can kind of easily stay in certain urban areas. To the extent that that's the case, it's really linked up with a long history of urban space being used to define who is and is not exposed to certain risks. And you can go back to medieval cities where the walls were used in this way. You can go back to a history of kind of redlining and disinvestment being linked to serious environmental risk exposures. We know now that in a large scale way, many of the disinvested areas of our cities, especially North America, are also the most exposed in terms of heat risk and other environmental risks. And we can link it up to the extent to which it's only when these risks are removed from formerly industrial areas that then they become subject to gentrification processes, and basically more vulnerable populations are no longer sort of able to live in these areas. So to me, these processes are tightly linked and tightly come together. And the other aspect of my research agenda from the green gentrification hypothesis has to do with this. So I just wanted to speak quickly about a piece that I have ongoing now, and sort of where that's taking me as well, and then open it up for questions. So why particularly might green climate interventions, and particularly climate interventions in cities in general, have this effect of potentially displacing or shifting or exacerbating more vulnerability among certain populations? Well, I would say that due to what I would call interacting riskscapes, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, green climate planning is simultaneously reducing. So we're trying to reduce heat. We're trying to reduce, we're trying to control for flooding and other extreme climate risks, simultaneously reducing, but also, and very importantly for me, reordering, shifting around risk within urban space, how people experience risk in urban space. And for me, it's important to keep in mind, we're not just reducing risk, we're also reordering it. We're also shifting it around. And so how does this happen? Well, to understand that, I would ask you, and I think for many people in the room, this is not a big leap. I would ask you to imagine you're an urban planner. And you've been tasked with taking on a project in a formerly industrial, somewhat disinvested part of the city that has been identified as really high risk for flooding, especially given climate change conditions. And so your task is basically to plan for that eventuality and to come up with an intervention. So you go in and you start by thinking about where does the flooding risk localize, and what kind of storm surge possibilities are there in the area, and kind of analyzing and understanding that. And then you go through the planning process where you start to do outreach and talk to people in the community and start to understand, okay, how are you experiencing this? How do you understand, the risk of climate and flood risk particularly? And what you start to hear is that, well, yes, I see that risk, but I also have this risk of poor housing conditions, and I see pollution over here, and I have the risk of earthquakes and displacement and crime and unemployment. And essentially what you start to see is that people in this area are experiencing a whole lot of interacting riskscapes within this one space that you as a planner have been tasked with doing something about. So you are well-intentioned, doing your best, and basically you work with designers and others and the community to try to integrate all of this feedback into an intervention that, as best you can, sort of responds to multiple points of feedback. It has its elements of beauty, and it brings in various elements of kind of best practice for planning that you can. Then down the road, farther down your career, what you find after implementation of something like this is that there is indeed an overall reduction of selected risks, and especially flooding and storm surge. The risk of that has in fact been reduced for large portions of the city. But there's also this other effect of increase of some risks for vulnerable residents, especially who feel an acute increase, and perhaps even that vulnerability category in some cases has expanded in terms of who feels vulnerable to some of these other acute risks. So those interacting riskscapes are really complicating your ability to effectively plan for climate action in cities. I've done a study that is sort of exploratory in this realm, where I'm trying to understand, how do people on the ground understand this dynamic, understand and feel and experience this dynamic of interacting riskscapes, and how we might think about as planners planning in this context, and especially looking at green climate planning interventions. So thinking about especially in the green space area. I did 2 mixed methods case studies looking at Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, California. There's a spatial autoregressive analysis here where I'm testing for particularly one driver of gentrification. I'll talk about that. But I also did 59 qualitative interviews that, for an element of them, focus on the perceptions of risk in green climate urbanism for neighborhoods selected on the basis of spatial analysis. So in East Austin, I looked at a neighborhood that was very much post-gentrification and had gentrified. It was very clearly understood to be a gentrified area. And then this is East Austin, and that's the East Austin neighborhood. It's one of the most gentrified neighborhoods probably in the United States right now. And then Bayview, Hunters Point in San Francisco is sort of the last frontier of gentrification in San Francisco. It's sort of, at the time I was there, at least, it's a pre-gentrification neighborhood wherein many people felt the pressures coming, but it didn't actually feel fully gentrified at the time. Both neighborhoods are high targets for climate interventions in both cities, which is to say that established existing plans and development strategies have targeted green climate urbanism interventions in these neighborhoods. In terms of the spatial analysis, the overall sort of city's green climate planning, which also links highly with priority development zones in the cities, are also the areas citywide that are highly predictive of gentrification, and that plays deeply into people's sort of psychological understanding of the types of interventions that were planned for their area, which is just to point to one element, not to say that this is causal, but rather to say there is this correlation, this spatial correlation between these. I have no causal evidence here. I really want to emphasize that. I'm not saying that being in these areas caused gentrification, but in people's understandings, and their understandings are verified by the data, that these areas are the gentrifying areas of the city as well. And basically, I just want to point to 2 findings here today. I'm going to point to one finding from the pre-gentrification neighborhood in San Francisco and one from the post-gentrification neighborhood in Austin. And these are things that, for me, are important in terms of conceptualizing how we bring the green gentrification understandings into green climate urbanism planning. One finding is that in the neighborhood in Bayview, Hunters Point, and I heard this also in elements of East Austin, there was a common refrain around the notion of reshuffling of perceived risk priorities, which is to say the priorities of the residents of the neighborhood, the risks that they prioritize themselves. And this quote, I think, is very reflective of what I mean. So one longtime resident there said, "Everyone is trying to stabilize housing. If you don't have a place to stay, you don't care that the sea level is going to rise, you don't care that your air is bad, you don't care about the quality of the environment." And this is someone who was an environmental justice organizer and had fought for environmental issues for decades in this neighborhood, and basically said, my priorities are totally shifted now. And she was an extreme example, but you heard this in different ways over and over and over again from people in these neighborhoods, that basically their priority list for risks had shifted because now they're feeling something different in their neighborhood. So that's very common in the pre-gentrification neighborhood. You hear it as well in Austin as well. But in Austin, in the post-gentrification neighborhood of East Austin, the more predominant kind of sentiment that was coming from people that especially felt quite vulnerable in that neighborhood was sort of an opt-out of climate interventions. And this quote, I think, needs a little unpacking, but it gets there in terms of what I mean here. This also, again, a longtime resident of East Austin said, "We're taking on the impact of so-called preserving the environment. We've been flooded where people have actually lost their lives, and we're in climate change. It could just rain, and you're high densifying. They're not doing the same in West Austin. So we're taking the brunt again." And what this person was seeing was, in the name of climate, there's sort of these other agendas coming here, and really that they're coming here and not elsewhere. And so they're seeing it as kind of a replay of former processes that have created vulnerabilities for them. And they're only able to see in those terms. And regardless of where you would interpret this finding, that's the perception of what's happening in the neighborhood. And it's a common perception. You hear frequently from people in this neighborhood. And so that is another key element of how people are perceiving risk and what's actually risky relative to climate when they look at this stuff, when they look at the plans that are coming their way. Very much in these cities, these are big development cities. Like there is massive pressure for development in these cities. And so basically, that is also very much part of the narrative. And if you went to cities that didn't have that degree of development pressure, you might get a different set of sentiments. And I definitely want to acknowledge that. But in these massively pressurized development cities, I would say that these dynamics are, I would argue that it's likely you'll find some variation of these dynamics at play in many of those cities. So what does this mean in terms of the urban risk shift work? Well, one, because of processes closely linked with green gentrification, risk shift happens alongside risk reduction. So we're not, one bottom line for me is to really remind the planning profession that we're not only reducing risk, we're reordering it, we're reshaping it, and we're reordering where it exists and for who experiences it. And so for me, internalizing this shift is at the center of just climate planning. If you want to think about climate justice, you really have to think about this reordering process because it is a move to link climate action with a right for all to occupy the climate safe city, which is to say, because the processes we saw in green gentrification end up getting expressed through climate planning. If we don't think about this, how risk is reordered, then we're not going to be thinking about kind of a right for all to occupy a climate safe city, which is why I link it to climate justice and climate justice outcomes. So for me, this is kind of the developing, ongoing narrative that I'm trying to tease out a little bit more, and it's part of work that I have going forward. I wanted to leave with this is my final point. I just wanted to leave with a quick teaser of a slight offshoot, but a very related aspect that is localized here in Vancouver of work that I've only just begun to do in partnership with a colleague that is visiting here, James Carruthers, and he's a climate modeler. So he's basically able to do things that I'm not, which is to take in large amounts of climate data and model what the climate outcomes will look like going into the future. So we're doing this in Vancouver, and we're basically asking, when we marry the notions of climate modeling for climate change at a very localized scale, and gentrification, how can we start to think about modeling for climate gentrification given the expected climate change effects? And what might this mean relative to how people experience risk in the city particularly? One thing that we can start with is the current conditions. So this is one map of gentrification scores in Vancouver. It's a very averaged out map, so it would look different if you looked at it for different periods of time, but a very averaged out map over between 1990 and 2016. And over here is a map of heat wave temperatures. This is during the heat dome that we experienced in 2021. What you can see, what may be visible, sort of fairly visible, is that there is a fair relationship between the most gentrifying areas of Vancouver are actually the hottest areas of Vancouver, which is to say that real estate markets have not uptaken climate risk. And this is probably, based on conversations I've had with many people, this is probably the case in many cities, which is to say that it being hotter isn't stopping people from moving in, isn't stopping people from buying houses there. It's not changing things. But we're asking the question, what if we model some of these temperatures out with assuming global increases of 2 degrees Celsius between now and 2050? What does that start to look like in the city? How might that change some of the dynamics that we're seeing here? And so we've started to kind of do a little bit of that. This is just to say that this is modeling those temperatures out to 2050. This is what it looked like in 2021. These were areas above 40 degrees Celsius. And in 2050, it would look closer to this, which is to say you have very few blue pockets left in this city that are not above 100, but not above 40 degrees Celsius when you have similar conditions as the heat dome. For us, this changes the picture a little bit and perhaps lets some of the social dynamics be modeled differently. So we're thinking through basically building those models and how, the point here being, currently things like heat risk are not really shaping gentrification dynamics. They're not really changing people's decisions. But what happens in the future? How might we sort of, given that that's the current condition, we might want to think about what are some of our possible storylines, possible scenarios, and how might we integrate the notion of intervening with a climate justice, with a kind of the idea of green gentrification in mind as we move forward.